Hi, my name is Bill Cass, and I'm a flight instructor with Air One here in Westfield, Massachusetts. I'm a flight instructor and I teach primary students, and today I'm going to be doing an instrument lesson on approaches. So hold on and let's enter the exciting world of instrument approaches. So flight by instruments is a critical skill set to have. And today we have on the first slide a demonstration of what we call steam gauges, or traditional instruments. Now remember that our pitot-static system runs three of the instruments. It runs our airspeed indicator through the ram port in the pitot-static tube, our altimeter through the static tube, and also our vertical speed indicator. And then we have in the center point our artificial horizon and our directional gyro. Now it's important to remember that these two instruments are run under vacuum pressure. So if you're flying on instruments and you lose the vacuum, it's very likely that both of these instruments will become inoperable, and it's a very, very subtle thing that can occur. It may not be all that apparent to the pilot that these two instruments have failed. And then our third instrument is the electrical turn coordinator, which also works with a gyroscope. However, this one works with gyroscopic precession. Gyroscopic precession is this unusual force that you might have felt as a child playing with a gyroscope. If you put you apply a force on the gyroscope, it is applied in 90 degrees from the direction of rotation. The long and the short of it is, the turn coordinator for instrument flight is not based on the vacuum gauge, but these two instruments are both based on the vacuum gauge, which runs a gyroscope which is resistant to turning. It works on gyroscopic resistance. So why am I telling you this? Because you need to be cross-referencing to the compass, because you've got to keep your instrument scan moving, even to include the compass, to make sure that the directional gyro hasn't suddenly failed on you. And that's true to make sure that the instruments coordinate with each other and that they confirm one another. If this, for example, is in a turn and this is saying straight and level, that's indicating there's a potential problem with either the turn coordinator or the attitude indicator. Now, when we're talking about an instrument scan for flying on instruments, we really want to do a couple of things. We want to do instrument cross-check, interpretation, and then fly the airplane. So the biggest question an instrument pilot is confronted with is where to look. And there's a bunch of theories about that. But primarily the attitude indicator for many aspects of flight is your primary instrument that you're going to be referencing as what we call your primary instrument, but not in all conditions, with your altimeter, for example, being a secondary for pitch. So in other words, if the aircraft is starting to climb, you would see the reference in the attitude indicator, but you would then see movement on the altimeter. Likewise with bank, again, the attitude indicator can be primary for bank. However, the directional gyro is secondary if you see motion. So you have to keep your scan continually moving. And you've got to kind of develop that naturally. A lot of people start out looking with the attitude indicator like a wagon wheel and looking over to the different instruments. And then others try to look at them holistically and look at the instruments as they present as kind of a group. Is there any movement going on? I think as experience develops, looking at all six at the same time becomes a little bit more natural, and then understanding for the different phase of flight that you're in, whether or not you're going to be looking to one of these instruments as a primary in certain given conditions. So, and the vertical speed indicator is also secondary, for example, for a pitch. Now, sometimes the vertical speed indicator can be primary. For example, if you're trying to create a descent that's going to intersect the glide scope, you may want to make sure you've set up a 500 or a 3 to 500 foot per minute descent here, and then you can verify with the attitude indicator. So the vertical speed indicator can be quite necessary as even a primary under certain flight conditions. So let's talk about the compass, because the compass is sort of our emergency backup. Let's not forget that Charles Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic Ocean pretty much with a compass. And so it's a very useful instrument, but it has some limitations, okay? So let's talk a little bit about those limitations. So one of the things that happens is because magnetic north, of course, it's not aligned with true north. And people say, well, where is magnetic north located? It's actually located over central Canada. Why Canada? Well, God decided to give Canada something, so they won the lottery and they got magnetic north. So, so as a result, for example, in Westfield, we have to correct for magnetic variation, which can be as much as 14 to 15 degrees just in Massachusetts, because magnetic north is that far off. And of course, remember that our runways are attuned to magnetic north, as well as our winds. It's your winds aloft that are true north. But because magnetic north is not aligned with north, and because the compass is a freely moving instrument, right, in a ball of fluid, it does some funny things when the aircraft turns. So if you're on a northerly heading, for example, what's going to happen as you turn away from that northerly heading in either direction, the compass is actually going to lag, okay? If you're on a southerly heading, the compass is actually going to lead. So it leads when you're heading to the south, and it lags when you're heading to the north. Now on east and west, this does not happen, okay? It's only on a northerly heading or a southerly heading. So that's what we call magnetic dip, and I'm going to just take a second and demonstrate this with a coffee cup as to really how it works. Give us a little bit of an animation about this magnetic dip. So remember that we'll use the pointer of the pencil here to always say we're on a northerly heading, right? So when I bank, now my fluid is still allowing this to rotate, but what happens is it's now somewhat constrained because the aircraft is in a bank. So because it's in a bank and we're turning, it's going to want to continue to point to magnetic north until it can catch up. And so the reason that's happening, it's happening because of the fluid and the relationship of the compass and the fluid, and you've now changed this compass from a free-flowing compass in a lateral position, perpendicular to the ground, and you've now banked, so your compass pointer still wants to point to magnetic north even though you've banked, so it's going to behave a little slow. Now just the opposite, let's say we have this on a southerly heading, and now where does our cup want to go? As soon as we bank, right, it wants to bank right over, it wants to come right over to magnetic north. So that's the root cause of what we call the magnetic dip. Okay, now another type of compass error we have is when you're on an easterly and westerly heading. This only applies when you're on an easterly and westerly heading. If you accelerate while on an easterly or westerly heading, the compass wants to move to the north. And when you deaccelerate on an easterly and westerly heading, the compass wants to point to the south. So we call this ANDs, accelerate north, deaccelerate south. And this is another one of the compass errors that you have to be familiar with as an instrument pilot. Now, one of the things that you have to remember, this does not apply on a northerly or southerly heading. So accelerate north, deaccelerate south. No, it only applies on an easterly and westerly heading. Now there's one other type of compass error that's worth mentioning, and that's the magnetic variation which occurs because of installation. We've got a lot of magnets and electrical circuits within the aircraft. They create eddies and fields, and so what happens is even though the compass might be reading one thing, you may have to interpolate a slight error on the magnetic card. And so that card is usually located right with the compass, so that's magnetic variation. So now we've talked about our basic instruments. Now a couple other key things for us is our glide slope localizer in a traditional presentation, right? So we have our glide slope here, okay, and our localizer here, and we can tell whether the vertical reference or the horizontal reference is operating on GPS or nav, or if it's operating on the ILS. Likewise, in some of our older aircraft, you can see it presented this way. This is really more popular in the 1960s and 70s, but aircraft are still flying with that configuration. Now, I've also thrown in a glass cockpit for reference, because remember, in a glass cockpit, and many of you will be transitioning to a glass cockpit, the presentation is much different of those 6 instruments that I just spoke about. So first of all, we have a nice big attitude indicator here. We have our airspeed indicator here. We have our altimeter here. We have our vertical speed indicator here as a bar. Okay, we have our directional gyro here. And then we have our turn and bank indicator here. So we can tell we're in coordinated flight with the triangles aligning up over the horizontal bar here. So this is a much different presentation, but this is actually the presentation where we're headed to, where you have it all in one presentation. Okay, and so and then you have your glide slope localizer right here. So you can see the pilot's vision is now constrained right to the glass cockpit presentation on one particular screen. And then over here we have our multi-flight display, which gives us our navigation information. And then we have our engine instruments. And this is a Garmin 1000 unit. And then you have your backup instruments down below. Okay, so and an instrument scan in this aircraft would include really a couple of extra scans, because you would be going up to look at your compass, which isn't depicted, but also you want to cross-reference it to your backup unit. So typically what happens with a glass cockpit, if it's not working, if the artificial horizon reference system isn't working, then you're going to get red bars here indicating that, and then you're going to have to transition over to your backup instruments. And you may not be able to do a particular approach if you no longer have the capability of doing one. So, okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the ILS itself. I'm going to start out with a precision approach. Now, a precision approach is an ILS is an example of a precision approach. And typically there's several components of that, but now you have a localizer array and a glide slope array, which are beaming a radio signal out for intersection with a receiver unit in the aircraft. So one of the first things you need to do as a pilot is make sure you tune that frequency and that you're actually receiving a signal, because as in anything else, these signals sometimes are not producing a signal. And you can see they show you in this illustration the middle marker beacon and the outer marker beacon. Now these beacons are really phasing away, but I put this slide in because it still demonstrates the modulation frequencies that are coming out together, and the unit receives it, and that's essentially how that works on a very cursory level. So so one of the first things we need to think about in shooting any approach is how are we going to interpret the approach? Okay, so this presentation assumes some basic flying knowledge. Okay, so here is a sample ILS or localizer runway 34 approach. Okay, for the Asheville Regional Airport, Asheville, North Carolina. So we can typically review an approach plate from top to bottom, and it should be done in the same manner. Although, because we may want to circle back up to certain aspects as we're kind of doing a brief. So typically what will happen before the aircraft even gets into the approach area, the type of approach will be decided upon based on weather conditions and based on the instrumentation in the aircraft, and of course what's available at the airport. So the pilot, if the pilot is a single pilot, she or he will have to kind of perform the same check that they would have if they were in a crew. In a crew, there would be discussion back and forth, there would be a pre-approach briefing, and the pilots would decide together, kind of review the whole approach plate. But as a single pilot, which is probably one of the most taxing events for a pilot, you have to kind of brief yourself on the approach, and really what you want to do is you want to read it from top to bottom to get you some information. So the first thing, and it's a little obscured by the little handy call out by the FAA, it's going to be the localizer or ILS frequencies, and it's going to tell you your approach course. You know, what is your approach course into the airport, okay? So in this instance, it's 344. And then they give you a little bit of information right at the top of this. So your landing, your one-way landing distance. So in this particular instance, you've got 8,000 feet. That's pretty good, 8,000 feet. Your touchdown zone, your altitude 2140. Hey, this airport's up pretty high, isn't it? And then you have your approach elevation 2165. Now, they give you little notes in here, and we'll talk about those in a second, but it might tell you whether there's alternate minimums, takeoff minimums, whatever restrictions might apply, but there's also additional equipment minimums. In this one it says circling not applicable west of the runway 1634, circling not applicable at night, ADF required runway visual range 1800, authorized with the use of a flight director, an autopilot, or heads-up display to the decision altitude. Okay, now and then ATIS, of course, you're going to have to dial in your ATIS to get the weather information that's going on at the airport. Also, when you do dial in that localizer, you're going to have to make sure that the ILS or localizer is actually operating, so you're going to want to hear that Morse code signal when you give that. And then here is a handy reference to who you should be talking to, approach control, right? And then you're going to want to know, of course, Asheville Tower, because you know you're going to get transitioned. Usually when you're established on the final instrument approach, you're going to get transitioned to tower, so you should have that handy. Okay, so as we're making our way then across the top with our communications protocol, we're going to want to have the tower dialed up in the communications portion of our radio, usually in the flip-flop behind approach control, because we know once we get to the final approach fix, or we're established, when we're established on the approach, usually approach control is going to flip us over. Now, one of the things we should talk about is what happens if we're getting vectored in for this ILS and departure forgets about us. What do we do? Well, what we do is we continue to fly that heading and we remind departure, and it's happened to me that they've forgotten about us and that we need to be vectored back on to the final approach fix if we're flying, truly flying vectors. Okay, so we look at our minimum safe altitude, and they've got us around the BRA radio beacon here. Broad River BOR. Okay, and so that's saying 7,900 feet, and that's always important for us to have reference. Okay, and then we can look at the highest obstacle in the terrain, which is at 6,057 feet. So boy, we know as we're coming into this that off of our left wing, we've got to be concerned with some really high terrain. Remember, this is about 4,000 feet above the airport. Okay, and then we have cross references to the Sugarloaf Mountain VORTAC, right, giving us cross references and to the approach as we're proceeding. And then we get special instructions in here, for example, no procedure turn into this approach. They want you to fly it direct. And then the main procedure as to how you come in, 5,000 feet, no procedure turn. So this is what we call the area view or the plane view, and we have to be cognizant of what the terrain is going to be like around us, okay? Now we get a couple other things here. So we know that this approach, we have a profile view, and this profile view is critically important because the profile view is going to tell us what altitude, a couple of important things, what altitude we're going to fly at to enter the approach, okay? And then we have the initial approach fix where the approach begins is a lightning bolt, okay? And then we have the initial approach fix, which is a star, okay? Which is our final approach fix. So we know that we can descend when we reach, we're at 4,400 feet and we intercept the localizer here. And then we know that the outer marker here is going to be at 3602, and that's going to bring us down to our altitude. Then here we also get, based on our category of aircraft, A, B, C, or D, we get appropriate ILS altitude, or what happens if the glide slope fails. It then becomes a localizer approach, and then if we can't because of the winds, enter into the prevailing runway of our choice on the approach, we go to circling minimums, and this gives us our height above the ground here as well, and the minimum visibility that we need. And then we have an airport diagram also on the approach, and that's telling us some critical information, including, of course, the runway we're shooting for, which is 340, which is important because we're heading at 344 degrees on this approach. Our type of lighting, high intensity runway lighting, is indicated here. Our touchdown zone of 2,140 feet, and our landing distance as well. Now, from the final approach fix, okay, which is indicated here with the star, okay, on the descent profile, it tells us our time. It's saying from the final approach fix to the missed approach point, which is 4.7 miles, okay, it's going to give us, for our various category of aircraft, how much time we have to need. So what does that mean? You need to time when you get to the final approach fix to the missed approach point, and you've got to make sure that your speed matches the time box. So if you've got a 30 knot headwind and your final approach speed is 90, you should be looking at 60 as your reference point, which would be, in this instance, 4 minutes and 42 seconds. So, and then we can circle back up to the top to look at any special instructions, and whether there's particular instructions might depend on, for example, if the airport isn't open and there's no weather observed at the airport. Sometimes approaches are not authorized, or the landing minimums or the landing minimums for the approach rather could go up. So this is a way we can approach the ILS or localizer runway 34 approach plate. We read from top to bottom to make sure we don't miss anything. Okay, now one last item. When we get to the final approach fix, okay, or the decision height, in the case of the ILS 34, our decision height is at 2340, okay, and we have two asterisks near this, so it's saying some special instructions. We pop back up to the special instructions, which say runway visual range of 1800 is authorized with the use of a flight director, autopilot, or heads-up display to the decision altitude. So the decision altitude 200 feet, if we don't have the reference, okay, then we need to do a missed approach. And in this instance, it's climb to 5500 direct to the LOM, inner marker LOM, and hold. So you would come out here to the Cairns inner marker, and you would hold at 5500 feet. And now you would do this with a direct holding entry, and it tells you you should be coming in at 164 and going out at 344. So again, we want to read from top to bottom. We want to make sure we're cognizant of any instructions, that we're cognizant of the plan view and where the highest obstacles are and our minimum safe altitude. And then we also want to make sure that we're fully cognizant of the missed approach. Now, we have to brief this if we're doing crew resource management. The two pilots are going to brief the approach. The pilot who's flying is obviously not going to brief the approach. The non-flying pilot is going to brief the approach. But there has to be crew coordination, and we have to set up the radios. We have to set up our instruments to be ready to intercept that. So this is just a basic elementary review of reading an approach plate. Okay, so now we're going to talk about a GPS approach, and you can see for this particular approach we're talking about Orlando, Florida, but note which airport we're talking about is the Orlando Executive Airport, ORL. Now, so when you get your instrument approach, your instrument license, you're going to go celebrate by going to Disney. Well, you're not going to use this approach plate because if you note right here, they give us a nice indication that Orlando International Airport is over here on the approach chart, just as an aside. So this is not the Orlando Executive Airport. This airport is actually closer to the city and would serve general aviation aircraft. So you're not going to go to Disney with this particular approach. But again, what we want to do is we want to look from the top and make our way down. So a couple of things. Again, our approach course, 070, yes, 070, that's going to be our approach into the airport. We're going to look at our runway landing distance, 5,700 feet, more than adequate. Our touchdown zone in this aircraft, we're much closer to the ocean. You notice that we're only 100 feet MSL, and airport elevation 113 feet. Again, we go over here, we identify, this is our nav approach, GPS, runway 7. Okay, now we come in here and we see some special instructions. There's special takeoff minimums at this airport, and there's special alternate minimums appropriate here. So, this one says GPS or required navigation performance of 0.3 required, okay? DME, and then again DME with required navigation performance 0.3, not applicable. In minimum visibility conditions, bright lights on the highway a half mile south of the airport may be mistaken for runway lights. I would think that's an important thing that you would want to know, right, as a pilot, okay? And again, our missed approach box, but we'll look at that in a second. And again, briefing the approach, we want to make sure we've listened to ATIS. We might quickly determine whether or not we're going to have to circle to land because of the prevailing winds. We're going to want to have Orlando approach control set up 124.8. And then as a backup, the CTAF for executive tower ready to flip over. And of course, if we are going to land, we want to be ready on the ground control as well. And this airport has clearance delivery, but that's more of a takeoff item. Of course, you have to talk to clearance delivery before you enter the movement area, and they will give you permission then after you let them know your intentions, and they give you your approval for an IFR departure or VFR departure to come over to ground control. Okay, so again, here we have our plan view. We can look for high obstacles around. There's a tower here at 9,946 feet. We have our minimum safe altitude for this approach, and we can see within 25 miles of Sado, we have 3,000 feet. We then come to the profile view, and we know that we're going to intersect this at 2,000 feet. We're going to be heading at 070 to the Izrak initial approach fix. Here we are. So here we are. Once we're going to connect Izrak at 2,000 feet. We're going to maintain 2,000 feet until we get to Henry, which is here. And then we can descend down to the Bulvi, which is the Bulvi waypoint, which is 2.8 nautical miles to runway 7. Okay, and this also gives us our slope down, which is 3.21 degrees. Okay, and then we descend to 1,200, and then we can, with our LNAV, we can go down to 800 feet, which gives us for Category A and Category B. Okay, so now when we descend down to 800 feet, we're going to maintain this altitude until we get to the edge of the runway, or 2.1 nautical miles. Now remember, on a GPS approach, there's no timing, okay? And then we also can look at our circling minimums as well. So, and here is again our airport diagram. The difference on this particular approach plate is it's on the right side as opposed to the left side, but it's giving us our type of light styling. There's an A noting that we have runway perimeter lights, runway centerline lights, blinking centerline as we approach, gives us our touchdown zone altitude. And finally, it talks about the fact that we have high intensity runway lights on 725, which would be our runway that we're coming into. So now that we've talked a little bit about approaches, we're going to talk about some of the special instructions. So if we see an A here, that's indicating that other than standard IFR alternate minimums are published. So IFR alternate minimums, okay? So where are you going to find those? You're going to find those at the B. In the index, you'll see a notation where to look in your instrument approach charts, okay? And so for each airport, they're they're published. And so in this instance, you would come over and you look at, for example, we'll use Cortez County, and it tells you Cortez Municipal Airport, and it's telling you which ones apply with little footnotes. You can see footnote 1, footnote 2, and footnote 1 again. Category D, they're changing the minimums that apply. And then it's they're changing the minimums that apply for A, B, and then C and D in terms of the minimums. So alternate IFR minimums are identified that way, the airport is identified that way, and then the city and location. So now that we've talked a little bit about approach plates, let's just talk about a briefing. What's our procedure as we're trying to set up an instrument approach? So of course we need to look at the ATIS, and that's going to give us an idea of the weather and the terrain. So hey, do we have, if we're circling, do we have to do a circle approach because of winds? Is there terrain we need to be concerned of? In some airports, you can have right-handed standard patterns because mountains are in the location of a left standard pattern. So you got to be familiar with the topography around the airport. NOTAMs, are there any NOTAMs? Hey, is the runway closed? Are certain radios not working? Is there a problem with the tower not operating at a certain time? Approaches in use, very important to have an understanding of what approach is going to be in use. A lot of times I will block the runway approaches in use as a special feature in my notepad as I'm taking down this information. Hey, what are the runway conditions? Are we talking about snow up here in New England? We have a lot of conditions where we could have freezing rain on the runway or snow. Any performance considerations? Hey, if we've got a wet runway or a slick runway and we're coming in a jet, do we need to be considering having additional braking power either by the engines or having a greater margin of safety? Is there a feeder route or expected routing to the approach? And that would be, typically there might be a standard instrument approach, a star, and you might anticipate that you're going to maybe catch that, and that might then turn into radar vectors too for the approach. So those things can change. Traffic, what kind of, is this an airport with a lot of traffic? Are you following traffic? Is it a radar or non-radar environment? Is it towered or non-towered? And are you going to be doing a straight in or circling because of the wind conditions? So, and again, as we look at that approach plate, we can think about making sure we've got the right airport, the right airport city name, and Orlando International versus Orlando Executive is a perfect example of that. The approach title, any amendment, when was this approach issued? Are you looking at the most recent version of the approach? Primary and secondary nav aids, is there a backup for Vortex to give you radials so that you know where you are on the approach? What's the final approach course? Barometric altitude at the outer marker for cross-check. Hey, am I where I should be? And don't forget that compass that I talked about. The decision altitude or decision height, the touchdown zone elevation and airport elevation, we talked about that. Hey, what's the missed approach procedure? Have it in your mind. Do you know what you're going to do when you have to do it? What's your minimum safe altitude? Those applicable notes, the approach lighting system, your visual glide slope indicators, what's available to help guide your aircraft once you pick it up visually. Required visibility and operative equipment adjustments, runway length, planned runway turnoff and expected taxi routes, part-time facility, is it part-time, is it full-time, airport diagram, alternate takeoff minimums, not standard. Now, if you've got a crew management situation and you're flying with another pilot, you're going to have to decide, how you're going to transition from going on instruments for the flying pilot to going visual for the flying pilot. And sometimes the crew is going to want to discuss whether the non-flying pilot is going to take over temporarily once the visual environment comes into view. So, having said all that, let's look at where we are. Westfield Barnes Regional Airport, and we're going to just talk about the ILS or Localizer 20. Now, we have got a lot going on in this approach. You'd think that this was an easy approach. Here we are at an airport with extra long runways. We have a 9,000 foot runway, in a 5,000 foot runway. But remember, we have a lot of terrain around this airport. You can see if this is the airport, that off to the east, we've got mountains that go up quite a bit higher than the airport itself. The touchdown zone for this approach elevation of the airport is 270 feet, but we can easily climb up to 791 feet, very close to the airport with some of the ridge lines that are here off to the east. So setting this up, let's say we can do a full approach. We can be vectored from Chester into the initial approach fix. We could come from Gardner into the initial approach fix, which is the Leeds intersection directed here. But so setting this up, if we were coming this way or we were being vectored and we're taking what would be in essence the downwind to turning onto the final instrument approach, that's a good time to start going through this and briefing the approach and making sure we have our act together before we're asked to do certain tasks. So first thing, localizer, IBF, dial in that frequency, identify it. Make sure that you're hearing it. Now, what do you need to know? You need to know that BAF, you might not remember the Morse code, but you can do a quick double check as you hear the dots and dashes to make sure you've identified the right frequency. Final approach course 204. Hey, okay, you're going to anticipate that. Landing distance 8,900 feet, touchdown zone 270 feet, airport elevation 270 feet. Now, we've got a lot of special instructions here. We have takeoff minimums, we have alternate minimums, and now we even have a snowflake here and a minus 21 degrees, which we're going to circle back up to the special instructions, but that has to do with the barometric limitations of our systems for the pedostatic system in cold weather, so they enhance some of the restrictions. So now we're going to get our ATIS 121.7. We're going to be doing this as we're being either vectored or we're entering to the initial approach fix at Leeds. And we're going to we'll probably be talking with Bradley already on 125.35, but we'll have 118.9 ready to flip in because we know that after we're established on the final approach, that Bradley approach is going to take us over to the tower. Okay? And so, so we have an idea of how we're working here. So again, our minimum safe altitude, okay, around the Barnes VOR, 3,600 feet here and 3,100 feet off to the east. Now, I didn't mention the fact that, yes, off to the west we have equally high mountains. In fact, we have one peak that's even larger, okay? And then, we've got to identify what other radio markers are available in the area that are going to help signify our initial approach fix, and that's going to include Chester and Gardner, in addition to Barnes here and Westover as references. So we're going to work through, okay, our plan view, and now we're going to go to our profile view to give us some additional information. We can see that we're going to come into Leeds at least at 3,500 feet way out here, okay? And then once we hit Leeds, okay, we can then, and we're on a course of 204, we can then descend to 2,200 feet until we get to Wessie. Now, this indicates the initial approach, the portion of the approach where the approach is commencing at 2,200 feet. And that's now telling us that we can now commence our ILS. How low can we go with the ILS? We can go down to 520 feet, which is giving us 250 feet over the ground, essentially. So, so now there's a couple other things that are happening here. When we get to Wessie, we need to time the approach, okay, which is our final approach fix, okay? So, and our missed approach point is 5.9 nautical miles in essence, okay? So if we're at 60 knots, it's 5 minutes and 54 seconds. At 90 knots, it's 3 minutes and 56 seconds. So you're going to time this and try to match your final approach speed with the reference in the speed indication for the timing. Now, importantly, once you're on final approach, you need to start thinking about getting the aircraft ready for configuration to complete the approach. So, and usually at the final approach fix, you want to be talking about having an appropriate approach flap set and the gear, you won't necessarily want to put that down until you get in a little bit closer, but be thinking about what you want to do, the 3 C's, your checklist, your configuration, and your compass. Again, make sure that your course is accurate, that the systems haven't failed, and backstopping that to the compass. Okay. Now, also be prepared for things that might happen on this approach, including the fact that you might lose the glide slope. And what's going to happen if you're going to lose the glide slope? You're going to want to be ready to go to make this a localizer approach and use the higher minimums, which is 1260 and the south. So, and then also getting that ATIS and figuring out, hey, what are the weather conditions here? We may want to be considering a circle to land. Okay, so in our brief, we're looking at the profile. We're looking at, hey, where's this missed approach point? Our decision height is going to be 520 feet. If we don't have the runway environment, then we're going to have to consider doing our missed approach. And what is our missed approach here? It's climb to 1,300 feet, then climbing right turn to 4,000 direct to Chester, and then hold and continue to climb and hold at 4,000 feet at Chester. And you can see the in this instance, you can see that it's going to be a direct entry with right turns to the hold. Okay, so a couple other things. Let's say you're circling and all of a sudden you lose the runway environment. What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to head right to the airport, heading right to the airport, and then commence the missed approach. Now, let's talk a little bit about the special instructions here. So, T would mean that there's actually takeoff minimums for this particular airport. A would mean there's actually alternate minimums that are not standard, right? And then, as I mentioned, the snowflake with the minus 20 degrees Celsius is a parameter that's necessary for the special instructions. So when local altimeter setting not required, not available, use Bradley's altimeter setting and increase all decision altitudes 44 feet and all minimum descent altitudes by 60 feet. Increase PEGI fixed minimums for the localizer 20 categories C, D, and E visibility by a quarter of a mile. For inoperative runway lights, the MALSARs, increase the ILS category E visibility to runway visual range of 4,000, increase the localizer category E visibility to 3 miles, increase the PEG fixed minimums S localizer category E to 1.5 miles. And then for the inoperative MALSARs for using the Bradley International Altimeter setting, the localizer 20 category E visibility actually increases to 3 miles. And then it says increase the PEG fixed minimums for the localizer 21E visibility miles. You can see there's a lot of, depending on your category, right? You're coming in with a really fast aircraft, depending on what's available in terms of altimeter settings and weather, it's going to change significantly. Then it says night landings, runway 50 not applicable. Then it says there's another double asterisk, DME for the Barnes Vortac, simultaneous reception of Barnes and the Barnes DME is required in order to do the PEG minimums for category E on the localizer 20. So you can see there's a lot going on in this particular approach, which illustrates the necessity of reading it very, very carefully from top to bottom, briefing the approach fully, and then coming back up to the special instructions and make sure your understanding of the approach is an accurate one, and then going back and looking at the missed approach. So tonight's sample was how to brief an approach and an explanation of a standard approach. And thank you for listening to Air One. I want to thank you for watching our video on instrument approach. My name is Bill Cass. I'm a certified flight instructor with Air One here in Westfield, Massachusetts, and look forward to some new videos in the future.